This lecture covers shaping, chaining, and imitation. When we discuss interventions such as shaping, chaining, and imitation, it is important to focus on the behavioral principle responsible for the change in behavior. As you may remember, one of the 7 defining characteristics of applied behavior analysis is that descriptions of behavior change are conceptually systematic. That is, the procedures responsible for behavior change are described in terms of the relevant behavioral principle at play. Shaping is defined as the process of systematically and differentially reinforcing successive approximations to a terminal behavior. There are 2 main elements to shaping procedures. The first element is differential reinforcement, where certain responses are followed by the delivery of a reinforcer, and where reinforcement is withheld for other responses. Differential reinforcement leads to the emergence of a new response class. This emergence of a new response class is referred to as response differentiation. A second element involved in shaping is successive approximations. When using shaping to develop a new response, the behavior analyst gradually changes the criterion for reinforcement. At first, the behavior analyst reinforces some response in the learner's repertoire that is a prerequisite behavior toward the terminal behavior. Gradually, the behavior analyst shifts the criterion for reinforcement to responses that are closer to the terminal behavior, while putting the previous response on extinction. There are a number of important steps to follow when implementing a shaping procedure to teach new behavior. First, the behavior analyst should specify what the terminal behavior is in observable and measurable terms. Next, the behavior analyst should specify the criterion for success. It is important to specify what the initial behavior is that is an approximation toward the terminal behavior, as well as specify the steps that will be reinforced in between the initial behavior and the terminal behavior. It should be noted that several different dimensions of behavior may be shaped. For example, behavior may be shaped in terms of topography, frequency, latency, duration, magnitude, etc. Let's take an example of shaping that was provided by my colleague, Dr. Volpe, regarding his dog, Sasha. Sasha was going to the bathroom all over his backyard, and this was making it difficult to keep the yard clean. The dots on this slide represent the different areas where Sasha was going to the bathroom. Dr. Volpe decided to implement a shaping procedure. His goal was for Sasha to void in a small area under a tree, which would make cleanup much easier. Initially, Dr. Volpe divided his yard in half widthwise and reinforced any instance of Sasha voiding on the right half of the yard. Dr. Volpe then divided his yard in half lengthwise and reinforced any instance of Sasha voiding in the upper right corner of the yard. As you can see, voiding in the bottom right corner was previously reinforced, but was then put on extinction when the criterion for reinforcement changed. Eventually, through differential reinforcement of successive approximations of the terminal behavior, Sasha was voiding exclusively under the tree in the backyard. You may remember another example of shaping provided by Hodson et al. In 1992, when children were taught to insert contact lenses using a shaping procedure. Many other examples of shaping may also be found in the literature. Next, we will review chaining. A behavior chain is a sequence of discrete responses where each response is associated with a specific stimulus condition. Responses are linked together, resulting in a behavior chain. Chaining is a method of establishing complex behaviors made up of discrete steps that the learner already knows. The goal of chaining is for a learner to perform the entire sequence of behaviors following the presentation of one discriminative stimulus. Once the chain is established, a single reinforcer is delivered at the end of the chain. However, each response produces an environmental change that serves as a conditioned reinforcer for the previous response and also serves as a prompt for the next response. Behaviors in the chain must occur in sequence and in close temporal succession. There are 3 ways to apply chaining: forward chaining, backward chaining, and total task. Each of these methods will be discussed on the following slides. With forward chaining, training begins with the first behavior in the sequence. An initial discriminative stimulus is delivered, and prompting is provided for the learner to perform the first behavior in the chain. When the behavior is emitted, the reinforcer is delivered. The level of prompting is gradually faded on the first step. Once the first behavior is mastered, the next step in the sequence becomes the training step. During training, all steps that follow the training step are typically performed by the behavior analyst. There are some advantages to forward chaining. For one, this method may be used to link smaller chains to larger chains. In addition, forward chaining is relatively easy to implement. With backward chaining, training begins with the last behavior in the sequence. The discriminative stimulus is delivered, and prompting is provided for the learner to perform the last behavior in the sequence. When the behavior is emitted, the reinforcer is delivered. The level of prompting is gradually faded on the last step. Once the last behavior in the sequence is mastered, the prior step in the sequence becomes the training step. One advantage to backward chaining is that natural reinforcement is provided immediately upon the learner's response. Also, because training begins with the last step in the sequence, the learner contacts natural contingencies of reinforcement on every learning trial. As you read in Slocum and Tiger from 2011, forward and backward chaining procedures were similarly effective in establishing behavior chains. A third behavior chaining procedure is a total task procedure. When implementing a total task procedure, training is provided for every behavior in the sequence during every training session. Typically, least to most prompting is provided by the trainer on every step of the task analysis. While the previous slides have covered procedures for building chains of behaviors, it may also be warranted to interrupt or break a behavior chain, either to teach a new response or to break an inappropriate chain of behaviors. A behavior chain interruption strategy involves interrupting the chain at some point so that another behavior may be emitted. For example, the behavior analyst might teach an individual to watch his or her hands using chaining. If the behavior analyst was also interested in teaching the individual to request or mand, then the environment might be set up such that there were no paper towels available. At this point in the chain, the individual might be prompted to request paper towels. In the event that an individual engages in an inappropriate chain of behaviors, the behavior analyst might break that chain of behaviors by following the steps outlined on this slide. Breaking inappropriate behavior chains is one method for decreasing undesirable behaviors, such as smoking whenever at a party, or skipping the gym and laying on the couch instead after work. The final teaching procedure we will review this week is imitation. Please take a moment to write down this link, which will allow you to view a video that provides a nice overview and demonstration of imitation. Imitation is defined functionally by 4 behavior-environment relations. First, you have the model, which is the antecedent stimulus that evokes the imitative behavior. Immediacy is also an important feature with imitation. The imitative behavior must immediately follow the presentation of the model. Similarity occurs when the model and the behavior resemble one another. However, the controlling relation is the most important property that defines imitation. We can infer a controlling relation when a novel model evokes a similar behavior in the absence of a history of reinforcement for that behavior. In order to teach imitation, the behavior analyst should first assess and teach any necessary prerequisite skills. Examples of prerequisite skills include staying in one's seat, looking at the teacher, keeping hands down, and looking at objects placed in front of oneself. Next, the behavior analyst must select the models for imitation training. Models should then be arranged in a sequence to be taught, with the easiest models presented first, followed by more difficult models. Imitation training involves the following steps. First, conducting a pre-assessment, then training models, conducting post-test to determine if mastery has been met, and then conducting periodic maintenance probes.